Okay, here I'm about to continue with Robert Avens, the new Gnosis, Heidegger, Hillman, and Angels. And it's in a section which is chapter 4, Language, Poetry, and Art. So we're exploring some Heidegger today, and it's section 2, which is called Poetic Dwelling. So how does Heidegger conceive of this connection between poetry and dwelling, and moreover, poetic dwelling? Let's find out. Avens states, Heidegger has identified language as saying with original poetizing. Okay, so again, the continuation here is sort of from last time where we were talking about language as the saying of the gods. And so in this way, a Heideggerian way of conceiving of what language is to go into sort of the etymology of the word saying. To say something is to show, to make appear, to release something into its own being. And so there's a way that Heidegger wants to understand language as saying, as something quite a bit deeper and older than we normally regard our use of language. And moreover, he's also connecting this, identifying this with quite original poetizing. So there's a quality of poesis. There's a way of understanding the kind of the original language in a kind of way. The original language as akin to poetry or poetic in nature. As he said, Heidegger has identified language as saying with original poetizing. Language itself is poetry in the original sense. And conversely, poetry is the aboriginal language. Poetry is the aboriginal language. So the connection that I would make here is not too much of a connection, but yeah, so through Tyson Yunkaporta, and also the book The Song Lines, the Indigenous Australians, whose sort of country I'm living in, there's a deep connection between their sort of, in a way, their metaphysics, and singing. There's a way that creation is sung into being, as I understand it, where these song lines are these sort of not only sort of energetic or ley lines that cross the country, but also lines of song, lines of original poetry. And obviously, I would like to understand a whole lot more about that. But the point is, I'm remembering a specific episode from Bruce Chatwin's book, The Song Lines, in which when an Indigenous Australian person was in a car, in a vehicle, they began to feel very ill, very sick, because they had to, in a way, sort of sing a lot faster in order to keep up with the creation that was manifesting or happening as the world was like rolling by. And so I just suggest this as a kind of sort of, I guess, independent corroboration or interesting example of the way that creating through language can be deeply connected to the act of poetizing and our sense of the world as it is being made. Quote, language itself is poetry in the original sense, and conversely, poetry is the aboriginal language. The connection there would be that these song lines and the enacting of them allowed for sort of safe passage across an entire continent. That also represented a kind of sort of fractal relationality, where there are sort of relational principles that are built into the act of poetizing that have to do with the law of the land, and yeah, where the sort of, in a way, the possession of sacred songs is a principle that's related to transparency, where if I understand right, many different tribal groups held the song or the law of many other different tribal groups, and when expressed in and through song and poetry, poetizing in this kind of a way, it was a way of in a way discouraging tribal warfare because each of the tribes sort of held the law of all of the other tribes. That's what I meant by fractal relationality. That was what I said. Anyway, that was maybe rather a lot to draw, but it was the connection that came to mind. We get a quote from Heidegger who says, "The essence of poetry must be understood through the essence of language. Poetry never takes language as a raw material ready to hand. Rather, it is poetry which first makes language possible." So the idea here is that our what we call language is in a way derivative, that there's a quality of poetizing that is, in a sense, primordial or first, prior to what we call language. Poetry is the primitive language of a historical people. Therefore, in just the reverse manner, the essence of human language must be understood through the essence of poetry. Avens continues, poetry, or Dichtung, which is the German, which Heidegger distinguishes from Poesie, Poesie, Poesie. I don't know how to say that. So Heidegger distinguishes poetry from this poesy as a literary genre. Like language belongs to the very essence of man. So there's a kind of poetry which is literally the literary genre of poetry. But Heidegger is talking about a kind of, that's why I said poetizing. It's a kind of enacting. In a way, it's a mode of being that is what Heidegger would call belongs to the very essence of man. As Hölderlin says, poetically man dwells on this earth. Poetically man dwells on this earth. And I'll have to come back to that brilliant Heideggerian collection, Language, Poetry, Thought, because I think that's what the title is. Because here we really don't get a sense of sort of what is meant. How can there be this connection between poetizing, as I've put it, and dwelling? It's not quite graspable here, but we'll try and get toward that. In contrast to the common view that regards poetry as, quote, frivolous mooning and vaporizing into the unknown and a flight into dreamland, Heidegger takes it as denoting the basic character of human existence, dwelling on this earth. Quote, poetry is what first brings man onto the earth, making him belong to it, and thus brings him into dwelling. Again, poetry is what first brings man onto the earth, making him belong to it, and thus bringing him into dwelling. Okay, so what I would connect here is the distinction between the imaginal and the imaginary. If we conceive of poetry as something that's again sort of frivolous mooning and vaporizing into the unknown, a flight into dreamland, this is a very sort of fallen secular understanding of what poetry is. That's not what poetry is at all. That's not at least what it's meant to be. And so here this would be connected. That kind of poetry would be imaginary or fantastic, literally of fantasy. Whereas this other kind of poetry, of which Heidegger is attempting to restore our sense, is more imaginal. There's a way that rather than a flight into dreamland, can we conceive of poetry as in some way a kind of imaginal practice that by allowing ourselves to be deeply affected by a poetic mode of being, that we can actually get a sense of belonging more deeply here. It's really quite hard to grasp this just by description. It's more something that has to be shown or participated in. Because it's not the sort of thing that can be explained, but what he's talking about is a way that poetry can be uttered and received such that we feel that we belong here more deeply, which he calls brings us into dwelling. There's a way that we can feel a deeper, uh, in a sense, existential awareness. It's about being more present. So there's a way that poetry, when sort of conducted rightly, can bring us into a deeper sense of being here. And that's the idea that that's what poetry is. And it's really close to the essence of our being. And that's actually what allows us to belong here on the earth. It allows us to feel. It's not just a feeling though. It's a you could call it a state, but even that is not quite right. That there's this kind of primordial act of what I call poetizing, or bringing one into dwelling on the earth. Notice also that this is exactly what we've lost. We've lost a deep sense of what poetry is. We've also lost a deep sense of belonging and dwelling. The idea being that we can recover both at the same time in practice. Quote, Heidegger's Earth, however, is not the empirically observable and exploitable planet Earth, but a subtle Earth, i.e., an ensouled phenomenon. Okay, so I just have to pause to say that Heidegger loves to do this thing of like taking any term, such as poetry or language or earth, and completely reimagining it. I mean, not just getting right down into the roots of what it means, such as earth. And so what Avens is saying here is that when Heidegger says earth, helping us to belong on the earth, he actually doesn't mean the planet. We would assume that he does mean the planet, but he doesn't. He means an earth which is ensouled, an ensouled phenomenon. And I can't, it's really hard for me to just sort of step back and explain what Heidegger means by an ensouled earth. I mean, a lot of work has been done in this series up to this point to try to convey a sense for that. I think what I would say is that there is a way of practicing with intention so as to develop a capacity, and it's a capacity to take up a certain perspective that one can call the perspective of one's own soul, I think reasonably, because it's about stepping out of ideology, stepping out of story, and stepping deeply into, in a sense, oneself, one's own uniqueness, one's own aliveness that could be called one's own soul. And when we can practice doing that, we also can come to be in the world in a different way. And that being in the world in a different way can go along with a different, quote unquote, mode of perception or mode of being that could be called um, a way which is ensouled and ensouling. So it's not just that one is able to get access to what can be called one's own soul, but that one is able to see and experience more deeply and more clearly the truth of the fact or the reality that the world is actually alive. That there is a quality of aliveness which is ever present. And that from that perception, from that way of ensouling, we can, from that point of view, understand differently what we mean by earth. That is actually what earth means, quote unquote, an ensouled phenomenon. So that was about anima and anima mundi, soul of the world. Now we get a quote from Heidegger, which is designed to show this claim that Avens was making about what Heidegger means by the term earth. He, the poet, is one who has been cast out into that between gods and men. But only and for the first time in this between is it decided. But only and for the first time in this between is it decided who man is and where he is settling his existence. Poetically dwells man on this earth. Again, he, the poet, he is one who has been cast out into that between gods and men. But only and for the first time in this between is it decided who man is and where he is settling his existence, where he is settling his existence. Poetically dwells man on this earth. I kind of hate to unpack Heidegger in this way because it's sort of criminal. But I think what I would connect is that it's kind of about I would say it's about the archetypal role of the poet. So the poet has a social role. There's a way that this kind of a person, well, they're an imaginative person, right? They're creative or artistic, and they have a sense for, let's say, a greater spiritual sensibility, I would call, typically. And the idea is that we can feel as the archetype of the poet, let's say, cast out from normal society, but also cast out from the realm of the gods that one can get a sense of. And the proper role of that poet, let's say, according to Heidegger, is to inhabit that between space, between gods and men, between finitude and transcendence. And the idea being that if we can hold that place, you could say in society or on the earth, that it can actually be decided there who we are and where our existence is to be settled, the way that we can actually create a home for ourselves in a poetic way, literally, in the sense that we can actually create the sense, we can generate, in a way, the sense of belonging, the sense of being at home in the between. Poetically dwells man on this earth. It should be carefully understood that this is not a way of reframing the role of the poet so that the poet can feel good about themselves. It's a way of appreciating in a different way why such people actually exist. Why are there poets? What is it about this thing called poetry, which I mean, there's a whole tradition, by the way, of you know, poetry from across the world. Why? What is it about that? Well, there's an idea here. There's an idea here that through that poetry, through that kind of way of being in the world, that we actually can come to exist more deeply. And that poetry is actually, and it's not just poetry in the way that we normally think about it. It's a poetic mode of being. Is it possible for us to imagine? And it's really hard actually for us to imagine without practice, without experience, that this mode of being can actually connect us far more deeply than we even knew was possible to the sense of existing and dwelling here on the earth. Avens continues. To Heidegger, Hölderlin is the poet of the poets, precisely because he has devoted his poetic word to this realm of the between. Okay, so I have to say something about this between space. So obviously we have the term the between, it's capitalized. Again, so there's a way that sort of any dialectic that you define, so whether it's gods and men, masculine and feminine, black and white, divine and human. I mean, this is another one of the same. Earth and heaven, left and right, I don't know, nature and culture. Take a pick of whichever dualities. The idea is that there is a way of opponent processing, reciprocal opening, getting a sort of dynamic reciprocal feedback loop going between those two that has, in a way, an independent reality. So it's about the relation between the two that is called here the between in William Desmond Metaxu. And in Christianity, it would be the Holy Ghost. It's the third term, the third. And so it's here conceived as a different realm. It's capitalized or deified as the between. And Heidegger likes Hölderlin because he devotes his poetry to that realm, the between. Avens continues. The mission of the poet is to be a messenger, to communicate to men what he has learned of the gods, and to name what he has found to be holy. This naming, however, is not an act of subjective, spontaneous imagination, but a response to the speaking of the gods to man. Poetry, like the meditative thinking of the philosopher, is thanksgiving. Okay, so earlier, again, as in a couple of chapters ago, Heidegger was talking about thought, as in, I think that was in thought of the heart. So the root of thought, as in thinking, has to do with thanking. They come from a similar etymological root. And so there's a connection between thought and sort of gratitude and appreciation, and by extension, thanksgiving. So that's what's being drawn on here. The idea that the whole point of being a poet is to obviously be a messenger, right? Or be a messenger of what? Well, the idea is that by inhabiting this between space, that a poet actually conveys an experience. They convey, in a sense, from the beyond, from the other side. And I think everyone has a sense of that creative people, that there's something flowing through them from somewhere. And that from somewhere can be conceived as the realm of the gods. You could just think about that as the source of inspiration. And this is what Heidegger feels is important about the role of the poet, to be a messenger, to communicate to men what he's learned of the gods, to name what he's found to be holy. And so there's a way that when the creator creates, when the poet poetizes, implicitly in that act is a making sacred or hallowing of, in a way, that which is created and that which is revealed, disclosed in making poetry. And that sort of act of hallowing, it's what can show this. It can, there's a way that poetry, it doesn't just hallow, it doesn't just make something holy, it actually reveals something new. So there's a way that the poet names whatever they found to be holy. They disclose it, they show it. And that's not just something subjective. It's not just something, it's not just a fantasy. It's a kind of response, and it's a kind of response to what they feel is most important to them, right? It's a response to, quote, the speaking of the gods to man. And in this way, equivalent to thanksgiving. An act of appreciation. And now we get another quote from Heidegger about this. So Avens says, a major consequence of Heidegger's outlook on the nature of the poet is that the poet is no more considered to be creative in the sense that he is thought to produce a world of his own imaginings, but to be a messenger in response to greater powers. The cult of the man of genius is given up. Moreover, the subjectivistic and humanistic approach, common in the last centuries, and largely also today, is abandoned. Man is visualized as standing in the open, amid all that is, with things below him and powers above him. So there's a kind of position which is being indicated. There's a position which is between, whether we conceive of it as between men and the gods, or between things below us and powers above us. It's a kind of space. There is a space between. And it's that space that the poet inhabits and dwells in, which in a way, when we can inhabit that mode of being, we're all allowed to dwell on the earth. And this isn't creative in a certain sense. Heidegger is emphasizing the quality of being a messenger. That between space, it has a quality of openness. When we stand in the between through poetry, we stand in the open. Amid all that is, in a way, we expose ourselves. We stand in the open, out in the open, for all to see. Avens continues, more precisely, how does Heidegger envision poetic dwelling? As I already pointed out, poetry for Heidegger, far from being merely ornamental, a bonus added to dwelling, it first causes dwelling to be dwelling. Instead of snatching us away from the earth or flying fantastically above reality, poetic dwelling brings man onto the earth, makes him belong to it. This is so because poetic images are imaginings in an extraordinary sense, not mere fancies and illusions, but, quote, imaginings that are visible inclusions of the alien in the sight of the familiar. Imaginings that are visible inclusions of the alien in the sight of the familiar. Poetic images are imaginings that are visible inclusions of the alien in the sight of the familiar. The poetic saying of images gathers the brightness and sound of the heavenly appearances into one with the darkness and silence of what is alien. The poetic saying of images gathers the brightness and sound of the heavenly appearances into one with the darkness and silence of what is alien. There's obviously a lot here. So what we're trying to get at here is more deeply. We want to get a deeper sense of what does Heidegger mean when he says that poetry is dwelling. What does it mean to dwell poetically? As I was saying, there's a way that this kind of poetry, this as a mode of being, this way of being, it's not something which is secondary. It's not something which is, it's not like an extracurricular activity. It's not something added on, a bonus, something nice to do when all the important work has been done. It's a kind of, I would call it a kind of sacred act or a way of connecting with the sacred or divine, which is one of the most meaningful ways of being. I mean, what was that quote from Robin Williams in I forget it's the I think it's from Dead Poet Society. This idea that like, hey, engineering and science, they're like awesome and all, they're really valuable and cool, but poetry and language and art, this is what we're alive for. It's that kind of a sense. Okay, well, so what do we mean by this? We actually mean that through that kind of act, I would connect it here with ritual. Through the ritual of poetry, one can come to dwell more deeply. One can come to belong on the earth. And it's really difficult to imagine that. It's like, imagine that the way that we feel being here is not as much as it could be. That we could be more here than we are. It's so hard to imagine that. And again, I would say that that's what's important about the act of poetry that he is describing, because there's a way that poetry, it it brings that forth. It's the shining in the sense of the glory of angels. It shines forth, and it reveals, it discloses more of reality than we had known was possible. And we have to accommodate ourselves to that. So we come to realize that we can dwell more, that we can belong more, that we can have a deeper sense of existing than we had known. And that's wild. Like it's not even the feeling that results in that creates, but the noticing that that is even possible, right? That there could be a way of existing more deeply in truth, not as fantasy. That's a miracle. It's just a fact of being. It's just one of it's a possibility that there's a direction that way to dwell more deeply. This is what Heidegger means by poetic dwelling. Poetic dwelling brings man onto the earth, makes him belong to it. Okay, now I have to try and unpack why. Well, through poetic image. So there's a deep connection here between poetry, obviously with language, but also with image. So the idea, and again, it's just an idea at the moment, but the idea would be that this can be practiced, that it's something that we can get a feel for in practice. The idea of it is that poetry can deeply interface with our visual faculty, with our faculty for imagination, which is creative and visual, and hard to put into a box of like, this is what the imagination is. So, but if we can understand that poetry deeply involves image, deeply involves imagining, then we get a sense of what Heidegger means. I mean, what way? Let me repeat what he said, and then I'll talk about it. He said that poetic images are imaginings that are visible inclusions of the alien in the sight of the familiar. So even just that. So there's a way that when poetry does this, which I was describing, when it can disclose more, reveal more, it doesn't merely change our sense of dwelling, belonging on the earth. It also brings us into proximity with that which is alien, in the sense of that which is strange and weird, and utterly new and foreign. We get to know that through this kind of poetizing. And we get to know that that alienness is included here in this way, quote, in the sight of the familiar. So what I would talk about is how we talked about poetry as in inhabiting this between space, between quite the human and the gods, for example, but also between the familiar and the alien. There's a way that poetry in this way can help us to belong more deeply, to dwell on the earth, to feel at home. But also to expose us equally, to include the alien and the familiar together. Heidegger says, the poetic saying of images gathers the brightness and sound of the heavenly appearances into one with the darkness and silence of what is alien. The heavenly appearances being here understood as those are the gods, right? Those are that which inspires the poetry in a way. I would finally just also mention that this is a quality of homemaking, the idea that homemaking, making a home in the sense of dwelling. If you really want to make a home, you can't just build a building, right? You have to there's an existential quality of, are you really at home here? Do you really feel a sense of belonging? And if that's something that you want, let's say, for yourself, then you're going to need more than industrial materials. You're going to need a capacity for poetry. That's homemaking. There's also a sense of consecration. So I would say that through this way, if we recognize that maybe we're not comfortable with the word sacred, or if we can recognize that it's really hard to imagine this because it's something that we don't even know that we've forgotten. And that's kind of Heidegger's whole point about the forgetting of being. But it's like the idea that in this way, we can actually reveal that which is sacred, that could be possible for us and desirable to concentrate, sorry, to to concentrate, to consecrate, which is quite different. Finally, I would connect earlier, as in a previous episode that I don't remember which one, we were sort of talking about a dynamic. I was talking about this earlier in terms of these reciprocal feedback loops between different dualities, black and white, masculine and feminine, man and the gods, and so on. Here we have the idea that there's one of those feedback loops between presence and place. And to me, I have to try and articulate what I mean by this. And what I mean is that the presence and place are, for me, equivalent to the archetypes of 3 and 4. And I won't dwell too long on that point. But I just wanted to say that I feel that the way in which poetry in this way helps to mediate between any of the dualities that can be defined is by enacting and inhabiting this feedback loop between presence and place. It's bringing more presence and bringing it into place. It's bringing more presence into place. And I think of that as the relationship between 3 and 4. And that's sort of here, that's equivalent to bringing man to dwell onto the earth, where man brings the presence and the earth is the place. 3 and 4. Okay, so then Avens continues, and I'm going to read what he said, a couple sentences, and then I'll talk about what it means. Avens says, the poet takes the measure from the sky, the dwelling place of the gods. Gods are the measure or logos with which man measures his dwelling. Gods are the measure or the logos with which man measures his dwelling, his sojourn on the earth under the sky. Okay, now I have to try and talk about what I want to draw from this. I was just talking about 3 and 4. I was just talking about and I'll maybe expand that a little bit more. I'm sort of referring to this sort of Gnostic prophecy by Maria Profetissa. Yes, I have to say this one time every video. It says 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, as in the between or presence. And from the third, from presence, comes the one as the fourth. From the third comes the one as the fourth. And that's one way of describing it's actually going beyond, but I'm talking about this in Heideggerian terms at the moment, where the 3 can be understood as, again, presence or the between. I would say that both presence and the between participate in the archetype of the third. And similarly, the earth and place and dwelling are all of the fourth. And so this relationship between 3 and 4, presence and place, I would say is a way of realizing Gnosis. So now I'm going to continue a little bit. So he was just talking about the role of the poet. And remember we were talking about how the poet can inhabit this between space. So what I would say is that if we sort of define any duality, for example, between gods and men, the poet is able to inhabit that between space and be in the relationship between 3 and 4, which is in some way between the two. The idea is that that which is between any two is not singular or static. It's a dynamic process or a way that can be called the relationship between 3 and 4. This is in a sort of archetypal and Gnostic way. Okay, well, why is that relevant? Well, I'm making it relevant. As an aside, I think that's what relevance realization is, but anyway, or could be. Anyway, the point that I want to make here is that he was talking about poetry and poets as drawing down, this inspiration. That poetry in this way is a kind of response to the speaking of the gods. So it's not just that poets just create whatever they want, that they just make it up, that they're inspired, that they're getting inspiration, that they're breathed into from somewhere, from the gods. from the source of the sacred. This is what he meant when he said, the poet takes the measure from the sky, the dwelling place of the gods. So there's a way of conceiving of heaven as an archetypal realm, the sky, symbolically speaking, as the dwelling place of the gods, as the source of inspiration that comes to the poet. So that logos, that measure, comes from, or you could say comes through the poets. And so now what I want to do is conceive of that in terms of the 3 and 4 that I was describing. So what do I mean? What do I mean? Well, earlier we were talking about the poet as bringing the presence to the place. 3 and 4, presence and place. The poet, embodying presence, brings that presence to the place and so dwells. 3 and 4. But now, here what we're describing is that the gods are bringing that logos. The gods are bringing the measure to man. To man. So here the idea is that the gods are in the position of the third, and they bring that inspiration down to man as the fourth. So man as unconscious, man as receiver or vessel into which the logos is poured from the gods. And so now what I want to do is try to connect those two different states that I just described. I was just describing how the relationship between gods and man, or human, can be conceived as the relationship between 3 and 4, because inspiration comes in the form of the logos from the gods to man. And once man is inspired, then man is the source of that logos and brings it to the world. And those are two different states of being. And the first, I would call, from the human point of view, is a receptive state. So we take the measure from the gods. I would also call this, through Jung, an introverted state. It's a little bit different, perhaps, than the way the introversion is normally used. But it's a state of deep receptivity, where man is unconscious and receives the logos from the gods. But then, when man is inspired and becomes creative, to poetize, to speak, this is extraversion. Literally taking out, rather than taking in, taking out that which is inside. Where? To the earth, to the world, which is brought into dwelling, which is brought into being, which is brought into presence. From the third comes the one as the fourth. And in this way, quote, gods are the measure, or logos, with which man measures his dwelling, his sojourn on the earth under the sky. And so I've done, that was the first 2 pages in this chapter, and I have to get through, well, I don't have to do anything, but that's the first of 7.5 pages. So I'm going to keep going here, hopefully a little bit faster, but it's pretty, there's a lot here already. So Avens says, this is about the poet again. The poet takes the measure from the sky, the dwelling place of the gods. Gods are the measure, the logos, with which man measures his dwelling, his sojourn on the earth under the sky. Man founds his dwelling on divine standards, i.e., on mythos. Man founds his dwelling on divine standards, on mythos. For Heidegger, therefore, quote, the taking of measure is what is poetic in dwelling. The taking of measure is what is poetic indwelling. Poetry is a measuring. Okay, a couple of things here. I have to speed up a little bit. It's really criminal for me to do that. I'll try not to speed up, but it's really hard. What I want to say is, so what does it mean to take the measure of something? It means to size it up, to appreciate it, to take something's measure. But the taking of measure kind of means when you take measure of something, there's a way that this can be giving. There's that you can give your attention, which is super counterintuitive. Taking can involve receiving when you take something on, but it can also involve giving, the taking of measure, when you take measure of something, where the measure is the logos. So it's a way of, I'm talking about sort of being a vessel for the logos. So Heidegger is saying that when we're dwelling, that which is poetic about dwelling is our giving and receiving of the logos, is being a vessel for the logos. Poetry is a measuring. Then Avens says, a poet in his capacity of the mediator or intermediary, the messenger, between sky and earth, between gods and men, is continually bringing things into the open, showing them in their imaginal essence. So to be continually bringing things into the open is to be showing the truth, to be unveiling or truthing, literally truth telling, showing things in their imaginal essence. Also, when we talk about the poet as having the capacity for mediation, well, that capacity is having space for. It's a spaciousness. It's a quality of having spaciousness. The idea that the poet is one who has space, who has unlocked space within for the divine, for mediation, for the message. Hence, dwelling rests on the poetic. In turn, dwelling is a specifically human way of existing in that it has the character of the between. Dwelling is a specifically human way of existing in that it has the character of the between. The poet's upward glance spans the between of sky and earth. This between is measured out for the dwelling of man. Okay, so this is a difficult section, so this is why I'm struggling here. So as he said, the poet's upward glance spans the between of sky and earth. This between is measured out for the dwelling of man. Okay, so what I want to connect here is there's a way that this between, again, in Christian terms, the Holy Ghost, the third, the relational space, that which is between the one and the two, self and other, man and gods, is being given independent reality here. It's called the between. It's a space. It's a space. And I'm saying that that between space well, I guess I'm saying the one way of being in that between space is in terms, can be conceived in terms of this relationship between 3 and 4, the archetypes of 3 and 4. one instance of which is articulated as presence in place. Another instance of which is articulated as God's bringing logos to man, God's measuring men. And so there's a way that between space, what do I want to say about it? Well, it's somewhere to inhabit, but it's not a physical place. It's that place or that space and that time, which is between all duality. And it's so hard to imagine that. It's so hard to, it's not something that can be grasped. It is a place, it's a time, it's a space. So it's somewhere, it's somewhere when it's a location, it's a position to inhabit. And when we inhabit that location, we dwell and we poetize in the same breath. And there's an idea here, and the idea is that between space has been measured out. So this is, I would talk about this as a way of conceiving of the fall from grace, the fall from the gods. Because that between space is that when we talk about the man and the gods, well, we've been cut off. We're fallen down away from the gods. And here this is reconceived. By virtue of that fall, this between space is opened. It's been measured out. Measure logos. For the dwelling of man. Hence dwelling becomes possible. In the same context, Heidegger uses the word dimension to designate the between. Dimension is not a stretch of space, but rather the meeting out of the between, the upward to the sky, as well as the downward to the earth. The meeting out, or in a way, the measuring. I think commenting on the term dimension here is too difficult. It's a dimension. It is a much better word of describing what I was trying to describe before. It's not a time or a place or a space because it's a dimension. So here I think what I would connect is the idea of revelation. The idea that there are truths that can come to be known that are not already known, that are in some way more true, that are revelatory. And so the idea that one goes toward what is most true, toward what is most revelatory, not by going sort of to the edge of the universe, but by going to the center, by which I mean focusing on what's here, focusing toward what's here. And so this is how I would understand it. This is through sort of Jungian Christianity and the sort of phenomenology of the revelation of the cross, the revelation of Christ. So there we had the idea, right, that the Christ event is a quote unquote ingression from a higher dimension. That something comes into being in a certain form, namely the form of the cross. And why that form is a totally different question, but that happened seems possible, plausible. And so the connection here is that this between space, this dimension is a dimension into which something can come to be. And so when I open it like that, when I try to indicate the between as an open space, the dimension as something that can be entered into, it helps me to imagine. So the idea is that there is an open space of possibility. There is a blank canvas before us. The idea being that we haven't yet noticed the possibility which is inherent in that dimension from beyond that dimension. And then what I would connect is the idea of not exactly correspondence, but complementarity. It's in Moby Dick, it's sort of piercing through the veil. And in Jung, it's the sort of compensating quality of the unconscious. It's the idea that there is a relationship between this side and in a sense what's on the other side, but it's so this is the other side. So what I have here is the idea that between that space, that dimension is open, is empty, is available, and can be entered into. And then the further idea that it can be entered into from somewhere else, but that our action, our intention, plays a role in that. And that means that I'm talking about the practice of revelation. I think the word for that is theophany. As Heidegger said, dimension is not a stretch of space, but rather the meeting out of the between, the upward to the sky as well as the downward to the earth. And so if we conceive of that beyond the space of the hyperdimensional space from which something ingresses, in a way that can be conceived of as the beyond, that which is utterly beyond imagination, beyond conception. And the between The dimension is the between. It goes upward to the sky. Something can come from out of that sky into this dimension. And then from that dimension, from that between, can come to Earth, can come here. Avens continues. The facing of Earth and sky depends on the dimension, whose specific nature Heidegger leaves without name. Man is man precisely in the spanning. He dwells by the spanning on the earth. He dwells by spanning the on the earth and the beneath the sky. This on and beneath belong together. Their interplay is the span that man traverses at every moment, insofar as he is as an earthly being. Wow. Okay. So firstly, there was a quality that Heidegger avoided naming the dimension. We called it the between. I talked about it as that which is between one and two. So any polarity, any duality, any binary split that can be named or defined. That which is between them. There's a way that it can't be named. The facing of earth and sky depends on the dimension. So one of those dualities is the earth and sky. And the further idea is that we are actually who we are. Man is man, precisely in the spanning. I had here the idea of the hand span or touch as a universal signal of greeting. Hi, hand span. So it's a signal, humankind, or hello, I'm human, I'm safe, I have no weapon in my hand. I'm a human with hands that touch. I can be touched. Man is man precisely in the spanning. So here there's a connection between the essence of our humanity and that between space, which is not regarded as something alien or other, although it makes that familiar to us. It makes that available. It includes that. We are who we are in our standing in that between, in our inhabiting that between space. And in that space, where are we? Where are we when we're in that space, in that between? Well, we're on the earth. We're dwelling on the earth. And also, that's in the way that we talked about before. And also, we're beneath the sky. In the sense that the source of inspiration is available to us when we dwell in the between space. And so it's a certain position or condition, being in the between, Desmond. It's being on the earth and being beneath the sky. And those belong together. There's another two. Not only earth and sky, but being on the earth and being beneath the sky. And they belong together. And they have an interplay. What is that interplay? It is the span that man traverses at every moment, insofar as he is as an earthly being. I'm going to leave that there. And what I'm going to do here, let me see. I think I'll keep going because it's too hard to come back to this afterwards. It doesn't quite work like that. And so Avens continues that we should not be far afield in identifying Heidegger's dimension or the span as the space of the soul. Okay, so we've been talking about I would say the archetype of well, it's 3 and 4 going together, so it's not just the third. Anyway, it's this between space. It's also called dimension. It's also called the span, that which is between earth and sky, or the human and the gods, or I would say any duality. And that's where we are when we're doing poetry. That's where we dwell as humans, on the earth and beneath the sky. It's where we receive the logos from the gods, and it's where we create with the logos. And so here, it's identified as the space of the soul. We see, obviously, there's a pretty clear connection between sort of poetry and soul. We would think of a poet as someone who really has soul. We can also see that there's a connection between soul and imagination, and also poetry and imagination. But the space of the soul, so what I've talked about is the capacity to take up the perspective of the soul. And in this context, what I mean by that is the capacity to disidentify from any of the dualities, to take any of the two qualities and to reveal that space, to step into that between, is to step into the space of the soul. Because the more that we can step into that space, the more we are in our uniqueness, the more we are close to being touched by that which is alive, meaning the source of life. So can we really connect with life itself? Well, that happens in this between space. So soul, anima, animation, aliveness. Hence, that between space, that dimension, that span is the space of the soul. And that's why, again, for Jung, to take up the perspective of the anima allows for the rebirth of God. It allows for the manifestation of the symbols of the self. It's the same. It's the same. So being in the space of the soul, being as much as ourselves, being as much of ourselves as we can be. I would say allows God to be reborn. But it's maybe a little bit direct. Anyway, this is how we get to the notion through Hillman. Soul and imagination, says Hillman, are a way of being in the world. This is clearly also what Corbin means. Quote, soul and imagination are a way of being in the world, a way of celebrating the phenomena without agonizing about their meaning and without suspecting anything numinal lurking at their back. Things perceived imaginatively are known and unknown, intelligent and mysterious. So this soul, if we consider this between space, if we can inhabit that in this poetizing way, that's a way of being in the soul. It's a way of living from out of the perspective of the soul. And here it's conceived of not only as a mode of being, a way of being in the world, but it's a way of celebrating the phenomena. So phenomena, the images, the appearances, the way that they shine forth, the way that they show themselves. Is it backwards? all things shining. Hence, it's a way of celebrating the phenomena, not worrying about that they're representational and that there's something real which is behind them, but celebrating things as they are. Phenomenology, allowing things to be as they are, allowing things to shine forth in the truth of the way that they are. Things perceived imaginatively in this way, unknown and unknown, intelligent and mysterious. So it's a way of drawing things up into soul. It's a way of perceiving things in such a way that they can be recognized as having soul, as having intelligence. I'm not talking about panpsychism. It's something other than that. In Heidegger's words, quote, the radiance of the sky is not only sheer light, but also the darkness of its all-sheltering breadth. The radiance of the sky is not only sheer light, but also the darkness of its all-sheltering breadth. The blue of the sky's lovely blueness is the color of depth. The radiance of the sky is the dawn and dusk of the twilight. So I won't comment on that other than to kind of spoil it. Well, it's so Heideggerian, this stuff, that it's kind of impenetrable. But what he's getting at is that in this mode of being, there's a way that, again, things perceived imaginatively are both known and unknown, both intelligent and mysterious. And so there's a quality of being both, being both. And that's connected with the sort of phenomenology of twilight, the between time, education in a time between worlds. And so there's a way that, yeah, it's so tricky to talk about this, but these times of dawn and dusk are supposed to evoke this liminality, this between space of not being one thing or another thing, but being a bit of both and neither. As Avens says, twilight by its very nature is impervious to the dissections of the literalistic mentality, operating on the principle of either or. It is the ghostly region of metaxis, metaxu, or liminality, the place and the time of soul making, the time and place for soul making, the dimension that permeates and transforms the profane duration in all its phases of past, present, and future. That's what twilight is. It's the twilight zone, you know. Twilight by its nature is impervious to the dissections of the either or. It's a ghostly region. It's liminal. It's a place and time of soul making. That to be in that, it's an inherently ambiguous, edgy space. It's a space of soul making because the soul grows from that earth, which is invisible, which is beyond the light, in a way. Again, in this context, no tree can go to heaven unless its roots grow down to hell. the place and the time of soul making, the dimension that permeates and transforms the profane duration in all its phases of past, present, and future. Heidegger also uses the word holy for the intermediate region between the immortals and mortals, gods and men. This is kind of what I was talking about. I was talking about, again, this between space is secretly the relationship between the archetypes of 3 and 4, where from 2 becomes 3 and from the third comes the 1 as the fourth. And another way of conceiving of that is that there's a way that this between space can give rise to revelation, direct revelation, which one way of thinking about which is is as an ingression from a higher dimension. Hence its holiness. Hence also what we were talking about in terms of consecration. Holiness is not the property of a god in Rudolf Otto's sense, but a name for all entities insofar as they display a numinous aspect. So it's a space for numinosity. It's an opening for the numinous. It's like the floor of a temple, or this, the space of the space inside a church or a mosque. Holiness is not the property of a god, but a name for all entities, insofar as they display a numinous aspect. Holiness is an ingredient that awakens, ensouls, and vivifies everything. Holiness is an ingredient that awakens, ensouls, and vivifies everything. Specifically, the holy is identified with the blueness of the sky. The holy is identified with the blueness of the sky. Quote, blue is not an image to indicate the sense of the holy. Blueness itself is the holy, in virtue of its gathering depth, which shines forth only as it veils itself. So I think what I connected here is when something comes out of the blue, meaning out of nowhere. Blueness itself is the holy, in virtue of its gathering depth, in the sense that blue is almost dark, but it's not. It's gathering depth, which shines forth only as it veils itself. To Heidegger, the blue is not an image of the sky, but the sky itself. So the blue, meaning, so we're talking about ways to describe something which is indescribable, which is why it's so, for me, so frustrating and confusing. In the I forget which episode it was in that series on Jung on Christianity that where I mean through Jung talk about this, the ingression from a higher dimension of the Christ event in terms of this the gnostic acts of John, apocryphal acts of John. So this event is described in many different ways. Now Jesus, now Christ, now nous, now logos, now Father, now Son, etc., etc. And the idea is that the idea is that that sort of event is sort of something that happens, and maybe that's happening, and I think sort of can be drawn out. And in the same way, this between space is also beyond description. None of the names stick to it because it's beyond that. And so we've been talking about it here as holy. Holy is a name for this intermediate region, but also blue. And blueness. So I understand that when Heidegger says blue, he means this between space. When something comes out of the blue, when something comes out of nowhere, out of the depths, out of the unknown. And so to Heidegger, that blue is the sky itself. That blue is the sky. That's the real sky. Conversely, a blue thing, such as sky, is an image. So the idea is, look, there's a total inversion there. The idea that the sky, as we sort of profanely understand it, well, it's blue. But the sky in a way is a thing. It's a it was so difficult because it's not really a thing, is it? But look, it is. I mean, it's up there. It's a thing. The sky is there. It's still there. It's still a thing. And it's blue. But the blue is deeper. So the sky is an image of that blueness in a way. It's really hard to get across what is meant by that. I can't say that I know, right? But I have a sense for it. I have a sense for it. So we say that the sky is blue. Well, imagine that something else could be blue. In the same way that when we say that the sky is blue, it's not just that we mean that the sky is literally the color blue. It's also the unknown. It's also the depths. Hence, the sky is an image of the blue. So difficult. Yeah, so here what I would connect is that this blue quality, obviously we have the connection with sadness, connections over with Kandinsky on concerning the spiritual in art, and also with blue with sadness and personal depth. It's a kind of primary color, the most common favorite color. And yeah, so blue here is also connected with the fourth. So the blue is the unknown, the void, the mother, the vessel. You could say water. Anyway, so I'm going to repeat the section. Specifically, the holy is identified with the blueness of the sky. Blue is not an image to indicate the sense of the holy. Blueness itself is the holy, in virtue of its gathering depth, which shines forth only as it veils itself. To Heidegger, the blue is not an image of the sky, but the sky itself. Conversely, a blue thing, such as sky, is an image. There's nothing behind the sky as an image. It speaks for itself. And is fully meaningful in its own right. There's nothing behind the sky as an image. It speaks for itself and is fully meaningful or holy in its own right. Or again, blueness, imaginally perceived, is holiness. Really, really difficult. Okay, but I have to keep going a bit. I feel like doing so. So basically, blueness, sky, and holiness identified all as qualities of this between space. Wow, this is really tough. Avens says Heidegger's identification of blueness with the sky corroborates Hillman's emphasis on the sensate character of images. In archetypal psychology, images can be enhanced by seeing more sense in them, by attending to it more sensitively, tuning in, focusing. So I would say that Hillman is talking about a kind of disposition, a way of attending with more sensitivity, with with greater sensation, more of an emphasis towards sensation. The way that we sense that things are, that images, the way that things appear can be enhanced this way. Not exactly enhanced. It bears repeating that the image is not a content that we see. The image is not a content that we see, but the way in which we see. That's so impossible. So I've decided that what it's better to do here is to stop and start separately if I want to, because it's simply too much content in one place. So I think I would leave that as a discussion of the between space in Heidegger. Yeah, with qualities having to do with poetry, with dwelling between man and the gods, with the logos taking measure, poetizing, with the term dimension, spanning the earth and sky, on the earth, beneath the sky, being in the space of the soul, imagining, being in the imaginal world as a way of being in the world, being in the twilight zone, an intermediary space that is liminal, that is edgy, that is soul making, a place and time of soul making, the dimension that permeates and transforms the profane duration in all its phases of past, present, and future. It's a way of presencing the eternal. And it has this between space as a position or disposition has a quality of holiness. It's a space of holiness, which is an ingredient that awakens, ensouls, and vivifies everything. And that holiness is otherwise known as the blueness in Heidegger. And we tried to talk about what he means by blue, and I don't know. If you tell me, if you work it out, let me know. And I tried to talk about all that with sort of some contribution from this sort of stuff about 3 and 4. Okay, and then we're going to sort of go on a little bit into Hillman a little bit more in talking about image and sense in connection with essence. Complicated. All right, I'll leave it there.